The implementation of a low-traffic neighbourhood is a risky business. Emotions run high because residents want a safer place to live, while drivers don't want to lose their red run. 35 years ago, the birth of a low-traffic neighbourhood in the Villabuurt in Groningen even went a step further. There were threats, civil disobedience, and a skirmish that not only had people talking about it for months, but that resulted in a broken nose. The other day I read somewhere on social media that the City Council of Groningen has started a pilot to cut off a red run in the Taco-Mestagstraat west of the city centre. Local residents had been pleading for this for years, as car drivers taking the shortcut make the neighbourhood unsafe for everyone. I was shocked to read the reactions this pilot got on social media. Drivers hate the idea that the Taco-Mestagstraat is now close to them, while cyclists can still get past. This whole thing did make me curious about the implementation of other low-traffic neighbourhoods. Was there always such opposition? Trawling through stacks of digital newspaper articles from the past, I came across the Villabuurt. 35 years ago, in the early 1990s, this quiet residential neighbourhood was ripped apart when residents went head-to-head about closing off a well-used red run. What followed was the Villabuurt controversy. Laughable perhaps in hindsight, but very serious when it was playing out. The Villabuurt is a small neighbourhood in the south of Groningen. Detached and semi-detached villas with large gardens are lining narrow, leafy streets. Now you should know that in the 1970s and 80s, commuters living in Haren had 3 routes to reach the city. You can see them here on this map. The leftmost arrow is the motorway A28. The middle arrow goes along the Verlengde Herenweg and the rightmost arrow along the Kerklaan. And by taking this last route, car drivers also took the red run through the Esserlaan in the Villabuurt. Residents of the Esserlaan had seen their street go from the quiet place to live in the 1950s and 60s to having to deal with more and more traffic, especially after the Helperzoom was built in the late 1960s. Commuters from Haren soon found the shortcut to get to the Helperzoom, to the dismay of the residents. In 1983, about 250 cars a day made their way through the Esserlaan. 7 years later, it was 3,000. On this map you can see the situation in the Villabuurt as it was in 1989. The Kerklaan is on the bottom right and the Verlengde Herenweg is the main road running north-south. The Esserweg connects the Kerklaan and Verlengde Herenweg and joins this last road with a junction where traffic from the Esserweg has to give way. Further to the north, the Verlengde Herenweg has a junction with traffic lights. It's these 2 pinch points that made car drivers on the Kerklaan use the Esserlaan through the Villabuurt as a red run, shown in red on this map. The Esserlaan is narrow and I can very well understand why the residents wanted something done about the car drivers using their street as a red run. In the end of 1989, the City Council came with a proposal to not only block the red run along the Esserlaan, but also much of the through traffic in the Villabuurt. Here you can see the proposed pilot. The idea was to block 4 streets to motorized traffic with so-called modal filters. 2 streets joining the Esserweg and 2 joining the Verlengde Herenweg. Cyclists and pedestrians could still go through. The residents of the Esserlaan were elated. The rest of the people in the Villabuurt, not so much. They quickly realized that not only through traffic was blocked, but they themselves would also have to drive further to reach their street. On top of that, they would be living in dead-end streets, and they worried about rubbish collection and the postman, who, by the way, always comes on a bicycle. So to the dismay of the residents of the Esserlaan, many people wrote into the council to protest against this pilot. The council, rather taken aback by so much opposition, then suggested an alternative plan. Instead of blocking off the streets, a one-way system could be implemented, thus spreading the through traffic over more streets than just the Esserlaan. This proposal still meant that motorized traffic would go through the Esserlaan, and the residents of that street were livid. They also warned the residents of the other streets, particularly the Hondsruglaan, that living with lots of through traffic wasn't fun. In desperation, the residents of the Esselaan came up with an alternative plan. After deliberations and meetings with all the residents of the Villabuurt, this plan was accepted by the council. The pilot started somewhere in May 1990. Let's have a look at the alternative plan that was used in the pilot. 3 modal filters were put in place, one at each end of the Esselaan and one just south of the junction between the Honteruglaan and Quintuslaan, indicated with crosses on this map. Furthermore, the Essenweg got some serious traffic calming measures, 2 chicanes and a speed bump. This to appease the residents of the Essenweg, who worried about more traffic on their street now that the red run of the Esselaan was blocked. The interesting thing about these modal filters was that instead of a bollard that physically blocked cars from going through, the council decided on a simple narrowing of the street and the placing of no entry signs. Clearly they hoped that the signs would stop car drivers illegally driving through the narrow opening. At least they did ask the police to patrol the Villabuurt more, so that drivers illegally driving through could be fined. But as the pilot progressed, it became clear that tensions in the neighbourhood were still on knife's edge. The tensions in the Villabuurt had been there ever since a lot of the residents had rejected the council's first pilot proposal. And now that the 3 modal filters were put in place, some of the residents were quite put out that the filters were also meant for them. They weren't commuters, so why couldn't they drive through them? There was a lot of not in my backyard sentiment going on. When one resident discovered that his neighbours were illegally driving through the modal filters, particularly the one on the Honteruglaan, he took it upon himself to stop people from doing so. This elderly neighbourhood vigilante would post at the Honteruglaan modal filter and step onto the road with his bicycle when he saw cars wanting to drive through. On occasion he also tapped the hood of the car with his walking stick. Soon other neighbours joined his watch. This of course didn't fall well with their neighbours, but at first the 2 opposing camps would just ignore each other in the street. Then one night, saboteurs came out and turned the no entry signs around so that it looked as if cars simply could go through again. This went on for some months. The vigilantes were fuming, especially when in the end the signs were not just turned around, but ripped out of the ground. In retaliation, pieces of concrete slabs were placed to physically block off the modal filters. The City Council for Traffic was appalled and said that this sort of civil disobedience would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, the rift in the Villabuurt widened. Children were seen throwing rocks over the hedges of adversaries. Dogs were being led to defecate on the driveways of enemies, and during the yearly neighbourhood hockey tournament, yes, it's a rather affluent area, the atmosphere was icy to say the least. Then on the 12th of January 1991, everything came to a boil during an ugly skirmish at the Honteruglaan modal filter. During the hubbub, where the 2 opposing sides met face to face, the elderly vigilante got his nose broken by a neighbour's fist. Afterwards, the police had trouble getting a complete picture of events because of conflicting eyewitness reports. Much ashamed, the neighbours stopped pestering each other, but the tension remained. The pilot still went ahead though, as it turned out that the modal filters had brought traffic in the neighbourhood down from 3,000 cars a day to just 300 a day, an acceptable amount. These days the modal filters in the Villabuurt are part of the furniture. They are no longer just signs, but actual bollards to stop illegal drive-thrus. Even so, large concrete blocks were needed at the filters to stop car drivers from going over the pavement. In the end, during the court case that was held about the skirmish in 1993, the opposing side reluctantly had to admit that the pilot had been a success. About 15 years ago, more modal filters appeared, these ones stopping traffic from entering the Villabuurt from the Verlengde Herenweg. The Villabuurt is now an even more low traffic neighbourhood than before, and a 30 km per hour, that is 20 miles per hour zone. In hindsight, the fact simply is that traffic found other ways to get from Haren to Groningen. And not only that, the completion of the continuous cycle route along the Kerklaan and Helperzoom in 2017 has made more commuters decide to take the bicycle into the city instead of the car. Times have changed and active travel has become more a part of life than before. After all that ruckus, the Villabuurt is now a very pleasant neighbourhood to cycle through and get glimpses of the beautiful 1930s villas. No one even seems to remember that in the early 1990s 3,000 cars per day would speed to the narrow tree-lined streets. I hope the same will happen in the Takelmestarstraat and other residential neighbourhoods around the world. People deserve to live in quiet and safe areas. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to keep cycling.